To introduce James Robinson for the closing keynote of the ESA World Meeting. James Robinson is the Reverend Dr. Richard L. Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies at the University of Chicago. Before joining the Harris School of Public Policy at Chicago, Jim held academic appointments at Harvard, Berkeley, Southern California, and Melbourne. Among the many awards Jim has received during his lifetime, I want to mention a doctor honoris causa from Universidad de los Andes, among several other places, actually. It now seems that Jim is receiving one doctor honoris causa almost yearly. He actually just came from Côte d'Ivoire to this conference after receiving yet another honoris causa. These honorary recognitions from institutions in exotic places such as Colombia, Mongolia, and let us say Norway, the UK, are a testament to how influential his work has been in revealing the underlying causes of economic and political divergence. Moreover, it shows the value that societies in these countries place on Jim's influential work. Jim's academic endeavors in understanding the interdependence between political power, institutions, and prosperity has provided these societies with a mirror in which they can recognize themselves and hopefully start amending their defects. I cannot help but see Jim as a modern version of Indiana Jones in economics and political science. He has conducted field work in Bolivia, Colombia, Haiti, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, to name a few. His book, Why Nations Fail, has been translated into 41 languages since its publication, almost on par with Marx's Das Kapital, and has undoubtedly influenced how a generation of scientists approaches important social questions. The fact that Jim is giving the closing keynote at the ESA World Meeting also highlights one of his additional qualities, his academic integrity and rigor. We ended up collaborating with Jim because he strongly believed that understanding some unknown causes of development related to how informal norms prevent societies from converging to better outcomes require more than observational data. He believed that the experimental method in economics could provide some of the missing answers. Jim, the floor is yours.
I just grab this thing sitting here. Okay. All right. Great. Well, that one. No, this one's working, isn't it? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you, Jose. Thank you for that very generous, overly generous introduction. Everything I say now, I was going to say, is bound to be disappointing. But to the extent that it isn't disappointing, it's because I have fabulous co-authors. Leopoldo Ferguson, I guess Leopoldo's in Mexico at the moment, and Jose, who just introduced me, sounds a bit kind of corrupt, doesn't it? Anyway. I should say before I start going, I'm one of the most fun things, in my life nowadays for the last 5 years is I've been very involved with the University of Nigeria at Nsukka in the East, which has been sort of I was going to say it's been life-changing for me, and it has been life-changing actually. But for me, if I just step back before I start talking about the regressions, I have probably most of you don't know that I have an extremely long relationship with the University of the Andes. I first came here in 1992, and I first started teaching in the summer in 1994, thanks to Juan Ricardo Ortega, who I think is running the electricity company now in Bogota. And I taught every summer for 28 years in Los Andes. And I think, for me, that was also a very life-changing sort of experience, because my PhD was in mathematical economics. My PhD advisor was Truman Bewley, who was a very distinguished general equilibrium theorist you may have heard of. But then I finished my PhD and I realized I knew absolutely nothing about what I was interested in. I knew about models and whatever, but I knew absolutely nothing about what I was interested in. And I had no idea how to start learning, and it was that invitation to come here in 1992 from Juan Ricardo Ortega, and then starting to teach here kind of plunged me into a different context and a different environment that gave me some starting point on how to get into reality or how to understand in a deeper way, or not even in a superficial way, things that I was interested in which I just didn't understand how to study. So I owe a great kind of debt to all my colleagues and long-standing colleagues and friends at the University of the Andes and many, many students. Okay, so what's this paper about? It's about antisocial norms, and you know, what's the research agenda here? I think there's been a lot of work on institutions and the determinants of economic development and the role of institutions, but most of that work has focused on, you know, what Douglas North called in his 1990 book, kind of formal institutions, the type of constitution, form of property rights, et cetera, political institutions, economic institutions. But Doug North in his book also emphasizes a lot informal institutions, norms, practices, okay? I think at some kind of ethnographic or sort of casual level, it's pretty obvious that social norms differ a lot in different parts of the world, and it seems very plausible that they may affect behavior and equilibria. So this work that Jose and Leopoldo and I have been doing is basically trying to look at the impact of some very salient social norms in Colombia on behavior and equilibria in games, okay? Of course, there is work on this. You know, there's a fabulous paper about, you know, reciprocity and clientelism by Finan and Schechter. Leopoldo and I did work on tax evasion. There's work on trust and social capital and all sorts of things. And a lot of that work kind of interprets equilibrium play as the norm. You know, so we're playing the dictator game, and I give 50-50, you know, we do 50-50, I split 50-50. That's a norm. I'm obeying a norm. So we kind of infer that there's a norm of fairness from the equilibrium play in the game, not really a game. But, you know, in some sense, if we're interested in this topic of informal institutions in the context of development, then a particular sort of norm seems to be of interest, you know, and we're going to advance a definition of what we call an antisocial norm, which is norms that people believe are normatively inappropriate, nevertheless expect other people to invoke. Okay, so I'll try to make that more precise as we go along. And you know, when I talk about the model, you'll see like why we think this is particularly interesting. Okay, I think if you look at the more ethnographic literature, there clearly are examples of what you might. It's not clear that they're antisocial norms in that sense, but there's clear examples of social norms that are inefficient or trap the society in an inefficient equilibrium. If you think of Banfield's, you know, famous 1958, The Moral Basis of a Backward Society, he has this idea of amoral familism, and that's really a kind of social norm. It's a norm about sort of how you're meant to behave towards other people and how you should expect them to behave towards you. Foster, you know, another ethnographic work from the 1960s, his idea of the principle of limited good, that basically society is zero-sum, and so you have to act accordingly in the sense that if someone benefits, it's got to be at somebody else's expense. And if you benefit, it's at someone else's expense. So, you know, that, again, you could say is a, you know, a characterization he characterized a sort of set of norms that would be inefficient. Adam Ashworth, who's an anthropologist of Africa in the University of Michigan, who studies witchcraft a lot in South Africa, has this notion of negative Ubuntu, which is a sort of distillation of, you know, the perverse effects of witchcraft on people's behavior in South Africa. Okay, so it's not clear, these things are sort of clearly inefficient in the sense that they seem to affect adversely cooperation, provision of kind of collective goods or economic incentives. It's not clear that they're antisocial in the sense that I'm defining it here or we're defining it here, that a norm that people think is normatively inappropriate, yet they expect to be invoked in equilibria. Okay, and it's also the case, of course, that a lot of explanations for norms are very functionalist. You know, so then it's hard to understand a kind of antisocial norm from a functionalist perspective. Okay, so what are we going to do now? We're going to pick a particular social norm, which, you know, in Spanish, no sea sapo, which means don't be a toad. It literally means don't be a toad, which essentially means mind your own business. It's none of your business. So let me motivate this. So this is a norm that's extremely prevalent in Colombia. I always like to give a personal example of this. So I was with my family, and we flew from Bogota to Armenia. We got out of the airport, and there was a line of taxis. And somebody ran across the street and said, okay, where are you going? Where are you going? Where do you want to go? And he picks our bags up, and he walks across the street with the bags to his car. And my wife starts negotiating, okay, well, we're trying to go to this hotel or whatever. And then this policeman comes and says, no, he's not licensed to pick up at the airport. So then we take the bags out of the trunk, we take the bags back, we go to the first taxi. Okay, and the guy is just standing there like watching all this happen. And my wife says, why didn't you just tell us? Why didn't you just tell us that that guy can't pick up at the airport? And the guy looks at us and says, what do you think I am, a sapo? So he didn't want to correct the antisocial behavior because he was anxious that if he did, the guy would have called him a sapo. So he didn't want to be called a sapo, so he just kept his mouth shut and he watched the thing happening. So the threat of being accused of being a sapo is a way of kind of deterring behavior which corrects bad behavior. That's the idea, okay? And we thought, so there's many norms. There's many norms like this in Colombia. I shouldn't start talking about them. The Colombians in the room know what they are. So there's many different norms you could study, but we thought this was a particularly interesting norm to study because it seems so closely related to, recent work in behavioral economics and experimental economics, in particular this kind of third-party punishment, this idea that adding third parties to games can make the equilibria kind of more pro-social. So this Sapo norm seems almost designed to kind of deactivate this third-party punishment. So that's why we wanted to look at that. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of issues. I'll just talk very briefly about the prevalence of this norm in Colombia. One example of this is Antanas Mocas, who was the former mayor of Bogota. When he was mayor, he had a whole campaign, against, basically encouraging people to be sapos, to correct bad behavior. And he had I tried to find a photograph of this, but I didn't succeed last night. But he used to have a kind of fabric frog toad, sewn onto his lapel to emphasize that it was good to be a sapo. It was good to correct antisocial behavior. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about that. Then I'm going to look at this experimental games that we constructed to look at how this affects equilibrium behavior, and also about people's normative attitudes towards this sapo norm. Then I'm going to talk about a little theoretical model, which I think when we got the experimental evidence, we found that we sort of struggled to think how it fits together. So we tried to write down a theoretical model to help. I'm not sure how deep that is, but at least it helped us understand how this antisocial norm could occur in equilibrium, okay? And then we have something to say a little bit of where did this come from? Where did this sapo norm come from? So we dug historically into texts and into some Colombian history to study where it came from. Okay, so just I'm not going to get into this in detail. In the paper we have, we basically combed through El Tiempo, the biggest national daily newspaper in Colombia, to look at the use of the word sapo and the context in which it comes up. Okay, it comes up a lot in the context of children and teachers and how children shouldn't be sapos, and which is interesting from a kind of socialization perspective. It comes up a lot in the context. You can see Pablo Escobar. This is just the size of the thing. Is capturing the frequency with which different references come up. It comes up with. You can see Pablo Escobar. If you've watched El Patrón del Mal, the concept of a sapo comes up in the telenovela. Guerrilla. I'll come back to guerrilla. Killed, cartel, criminal, violence, police, you don't be a sapo, don't tell the police what's going on, you shouldn't inform, etc. Okay, so it comes up in lots of different contexts, just to sort of give you some sense of, how important this is. I guess you could sort of say, well, the experimental game will tell you something about that in the sense of how sensitive people are, but just as a kind of reality check on this concept coming up. Okay, so just as to anticipate the main results, we're going to take a very standard dictator game where we add the third party, and we're going to just do the very standard baseline, especially the Fair and Fishbacker version of that, where you look at how adding a third party affects the equilibrium and affects the extent of fairness or pro-sociality in equilibrium. But then we're going to allow the dictator who's punished by a third party to call the third party a sapo, basically. So we're just going to add an extra move in the extensive form game to allow the person to call the person a sapo. So we didn't use exactly that expression. We thought maybe that's a bit too Colombian, So we used a kind of analogous expression of mind your own business. We did kind of investigate whether the students who did this at Los Andes actually associate this sapo expression with mind your own business, and they did, but we thought this had more kind of external validity and looked a little less, Colombian is too much of a Colombianism, okay? And then, so the basic result is we find exactly the fair Fishbacker result, which is when you add the third party, then the dictator becomes more generous, so that's the kind of very standard result. And then once you add in the sapo treatment, that effect is completely unraveled, basically. So allowing the punished dictator to accuse the third party of being a sapo unravels the positive effect completely unravels the positive effect of adding that third party, okay? But when you look at the people's normative views about it, so we ask people, is it inappropriate to call people a sapo, or is it appropriate? Or is it appropriate that people should be fair, or that third party should punish unfairness? What we find is that most people think that it is good to be fair. It is socially appropriate to punish unfair behavior. It's socially inappropriate to call people a sapo. Nevertheless, they also expect a majority of people to exercise the right to call people a sapo. So that's this combination of it's normatively unattractive, but people still expect, a majority of people still expect that people will accuse third-party punishers of being sapos. Okay, so that seemed to us, having the model is just trying to clarify how those two things can exist in equilibrium. Okay, all right, and just to emphasize here, this is very different from this notion of pluralistic ignorance, which is very popular. Think of the work of Leo Burstein, and now Eliana LaFerrara is working on this, with respect to female genital mutilation. Leo's done this in different contexts. So this seems to be a very different situation. It's not that people have incorrect beliefs about what other Colombians think. They correctly understand that Colombians think it's inappropriate to call people a sapo. Nevertheless, in equilibrium, they think that a majority of people will call people a sapo if punished. Okay. When can such an antisocial norm exist? We basically develop a model which is inspired by this work by Alberto Bicin and Thierry Verdier, who kind of developed this evolutionary model of endogenous social norms where parents socialize children. It seemed to us to be the right framework. And in that model, we kind of add a little bit by, after children are socialized, we allow them to play a social dilemma game. So in the paper, we kind of clarify, what's the connection between the dictator game with third-party punishment and a social dilemma, but we wanted to do it in this context because, again, we thought this was a little bit more general and might be of a little bit more general interest. And if you think about a social dilemma game, there's a Pareto inefficient outcome, and what's an antisocial norm look like? Well, we wanted to look at norms that a kind of an inefficient norm would be a norm that supported the Pareto inefficient outcome. Okay, so that's how we want to think about that. Think about that as that norm. There's two types of parents. There's those that think it's appropriate and they think it's inappropriate. Okay, so it's appropriate, to cheat in the prisoner's dilemma, or it's inappropriate. Okay, and if you think it's inappropriate, but you nevertheless do it, you pay some cost. So that's the kind of standard way of doing it. And then what we show, maybe I'll talk about this, maybe it's more efficient to talk about this when I get to the model, but we establish conditions under which you have a heterogeneous steady state where there's people who, there's people who think it's appropriate and there's people who think it's inappropriate. And then we characterize the circumstances under which a majority of people think that it's inappropriate to cheat in the prisoner's dilemma or in the social dilemma. But nevertheless, in equilibrium, a majority of people will do it. And that's really about heterogeneity within this set of people who think it's inappropriate. So majority of people think it's inappropriate. Nevertheless, a majority of people can still cheat in the social dilemma, and you get that because people who think it's appropriate to cheat will cheat, and some subset of the people who think it's inappropriate will also cheat, and that's just heterogeneity within the, I don't know how deep it is, but we found it useful, so maybe you will. Okay, but I don't feel like this is very clear, so I'll talk about it in more detail when I get to the model. I'll go through the model, and then I'll talk a little bit about the history of this. So, where did this no sé sapo, where did it come from? I think like what we've discovered is the likely ancestry of this is from Spain. It comes from Spain, even maybe El Quijote. But what we discovered is that the use of this clearly intensified in Colombia in the 1950s in a period called La Violencia, which was a kind of civil war that went on from about 1948 to 1958. And so what we did was we administered a survey to the participants about their kind of grandparents' experience in La Violencia, like were they victimized during La Violencia? Were their grandparents liberals? Because this was a civil war kind of mostly between the conservative and liberal parties. The conservative party was in power, and a lot of the victimization was of liberals. And so then we looked at, we collected a survey of that, and then we looked at how that affected the way people played in equilibrium. So there's some results that basically people with a family history of exposure to La Violencia or victimization during La Violencia basically are more sensitive when you add to this sapo treatment. They behave systematically differently, as I'll show you. So that's not an explanation for where this thing came from, but it is an explanation for why maybe it's so prevalent in Colombia. I think, what we've discovered is that this happens in the 1950s, but then it spreads into popular culture by the 1960s and 1970s, and then it blows up when the drug economy starts. So a little bit, I'll show you that later on. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about the literature, I'm just going to plow straight into the experimental setup. You're going to tell me, when do I shut up, Jose, exactly? Tell me when I should shut up.
Yes, I'll let you know. 15.
Okay, all right. Okay, great. Okay, so this is a very, standard game. We thought, the attractive aspect of this was to keep this as conventional as possible. So this is very much like the Fair and Fishbacker 2004 paper. There's a sender or a dictator who gets an endowment of tokens and decides how much to split between themselves, and a receiver. So the receiver is just a kind of dummy player. The receiver has a zero endowment, and the receiver receives whatever the dictator or the sender gives him or her, and then there's a third party. So in the baseline, the third party is just a sort of dummy player, and then we do a treatment where the third party can punish unfairness by the sender, and just using, for every one experimental token that they spend, they reduce the sender's payoffs by 3 experimental tokens. Okay, so that is the very standard sort of third-party punishment game. And then what we do is, so that's the dictator game, the baseline with the third party just kind of sitting there. Then the third party gets to take moves, and then we add the third party with the sapo. Okay, and the only difference is a punished dictator or sender can send this message, mind your own business, okay? And that has no consequences for anyone's payoffs. It's just like, just mind your own business, okay? So we did this, Jose did this with students at the University of the Andes here. not a very representative subsample of Colombian society, I have to say, but just, throwing that out there, I don't have anything much to say other than, but, just as a caveat, it's not very representative of Colombian society. Okay, and, just here, and here's the basic results. I used to get a lot of emails from people telling me, I don't know why Robinson, he talks about extractive institutions, and he's teaching at the University of the Andes every summer. That's the epitome of extractive. Those are the people who are benefiting from the extractive institutions. He should go teach at the Universidad Nacional if he cares about extractive institutions. Okay. Anyway, all right. So, sorry for that digression. Back to the results. So here's the basic result in the three the three experimental treatments. Okay, so the first is just the dictator game with the dummy third party. So you can see that there's 100 experimental tokens. So this is what they send. This is the amount sent. So it's about 25. Okay, so they keep about 3/4 of the initial endowment. The second treatment, when you add just the third party with an endogenous kind of action space, you can see that the pro-sociality goes up. So the dictator now becomes more generous. So this is the classic kind of fair Fischbacher result. And then the darkest column here, the darkest bar here, is when we add the Sapo treatment, and then you can see that then that goes down, and in fact it's statistically indistinguishable from the dictator game with just the dummy third party. Okay, so this, I guess this is the main sort of result, which is interesting, which is having this ability to kind of accuse someone of being a Sapo seems to deter the third party coming in a second, and it allows the dictator to kind of be less fair, okay? So how do I know it deters the third party? Well, here's the deduction points, sort of using the strategy method by the third party, and this is just looking at, the two options where the third party gets to go. The lighter column is just the dictator, the third party without the Sapo, and then the darker color is with the Sapo. So you can see here, if the dictator gives nothing, then there's about 20 deduction points, basically. So, there's one, you use one to reduce the payoff by 3, and then you can see that falls as the dictator becomes more generous. Then the deduction points fall, but I guess what we find interesting here is that once you introduce this Sapo treatment, then it seems like uniformly the deduction points that the third party is willing to hit the dictator with, penalize the dictator with, falls across uniformly across the whole the whole spectrum there. Okay, so the obvious mechanism for how adding this Sapo move into the game leads to this kind of unraveling of this third-party effect is that the third party, like the taxista, in Armenia, in the airport of Armenia, knows that, if he corrects the socially inappropriate behavior, he's going to be called a Sapo. He doesn't want to be called a Sapo because he knows he's violating a social norm, so he doesn't do it. So then you get less fair behavior in equilibrium. Okay, so of course, I started talking about inefficiency. There's no inefficiency here in this game. You're just sharing a fixed amount of money. In fact, if anything, the inefficiency is, the third party burning money. So, but we went backwards and forwards between how to formulate this, and in the end, it just seemed very advantageous to be able to compare this with the original fair Fischbacher model, and that's why we did it the way we did it. Okay, so that's the basic result. Let me now talk about kind of how people think about this normatively. All right, and the way we approach this is using this kind of Krupke and Weber method of sort of incentivizing people's eliciting people's belief in this kind of incentivized way of rewarding people if they guess, if they guess right, they guess what other people are other people believe, okay? And what we find is, let me show you the data. Okay, so let's look at receivers and senders. So imagine, like, the receivers here are sort of dummy players, you know. So we ask the receivers, you know, what do they expect? You know, do they expect senders, you know, who are punished by third parties to accuse them of being a sapo? Okay, and you can see that 55% of receivers expected punished senders to basically send the sapo message. In the first round of this, you know, there's a power issue here, but 14% of senders who are punished actually use the sapo message, but 55% of the receivers expected people who are punished to use the sapo message. Okay, I'm only going to show you results from like one-shot version of the game, again, because that just seemed easier to compare to Fair and Fishbacker. We did do multiple rounds of the game, and in the end, in fact, a third of dictators who were punished ended up sending the sapo message. So more than just this in the first round. But okay, so just to say, you know, here's 55% of receivers think that punished senders will send this sapo message. Okay, I said that. Okay, so what about the fairness or unfairness of this behavior? Okay, so the lighter column is the receiver, and then the darker is now we ask the third party. Okay, so on the vertical axis, it's the percentage of subjects who think that it's socially appropriate to be unfair in the first two columns. Okay, so you can see there that 60%. So what does that mean? It means give a half, basically. So unfair means fair means give a half. Do you think it's socially appropriate to give a half? And you can see that 60% of receivers say it's socially appropriate to give a half, and an even greater number, almost 70% of third parties say it's socially appropriate to give a half. Okay. What about sanctioning senders who are unfair, senders who don't give a half? Well, now you see over 80% of receivers think that it's okay to sanction. Yes, it's appropriate to sanction senders who are unfair. And that's pretty similar with third party, about 80%. So a large majority of receivers and third party think it's socially appropriate to punish unfairness. Okay? What about invoking the sapo norm? Is it socially appropriate to call someone a sapo if they correct your behavior? No. Okay? So 80% of people say it's socially, receivers and senders, basically, receivers and third parties say it's socially inappropriate to use the sapo norm, okay, to invoke the sapo norm. So I think this was, you know, particularly nice because here we have the data from the receivers, so 55%, so just motivating this definition of an antisocial norm as a social norm which people think, you know, the majority of people think is socially inappropriate, but nevertheless, they believe that a majority of people will invoke it in equilibrium. You can see here a majority of the receivers think that it will be invoked in equilibrium, but nevertheless, a large majority of receivers think it's socially inappropriate to use the sapo norm. Okay, so the model is really helping to kind of understand that combination. Okay. Oh yes, yeah, Jose is very good at all these fancy overleaf techniques. So I need to practice my. Okay, all right. I gave the game away. Okay, so here's the summary. So you know, here's the summary. So there's more things than this, but just to kind of try to keep the main message simple. You know, introducing this sapo, allowing people to accuse the third party of being a sapo, neutralizes this positive effect of third-party enforcement on fairness, and nevertheless you have this kind of paradoxical, seemed to us to be quite paradoxical. I guess when we went into this, we weren't, I mean, maybe the Colombians knew more about it than I did, but it wasn't clear to me like what we were going to find in terms of people's attitudes towards invoking the sapo norm. And I guess that might be where the sort of somehow the non-representativeness of Los Andes students would be it would be important, in thinking about, that's where we are. So that's what we have. Anyway, so let's run with that, and I just explained, what we think is interesting, which is this combination of thinking that it's normatively unappealing, but nevertheless believing that a majority of people will invoke it in equilibrium. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the model a little bit, just to give you a sense of how we thought about kind of rationalizing that. And then, I'm not saying we're not testing the model or whatever. The model is just trying to kind of help us think about what that equilibrium looks like. And then I'll come back to the history and talk about this la violencia and how that affects kind of equilibrium play. Okay, so it's very similar to the Bissin-Verdier type setup. There's a very nice paper by Guido Tabellini also applying these techniques. As I said, we're going to look at it. We're going to look at this as a classic kind of social dilemma, because it just seemed like more appealing to have a little bit more general than we could write down a model. It's also much simpler, of course, than writing down the extensive form of the dictator game with third-party punishment. So we look at that in the appendix, but I'm not going to talk about that. I just want to talk about this as a social dilemma and think about, under what circumstances can you sustain a norm which says, it's appropriate to cheat in the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, so think of there's two there's people who think it's appropriate, and there's people who think it's inappropriate. Okay, and XA is going to be, there's a unit mass of people in the game. XA is the fraction that think the norm is appropriate, so it's appropriate to cheat in the prisoner's dilemma or in the social dilemma, and the fraction XI is the fraction that think it's inappropriate. Okay, so, and there's going to be two sorts of parents. There's going to be parents who think it's appropriate and think it's inappropriate, and they can exert effort a la Bessin and Verdier to socialize their children. So as in Bessin and Verdier, you'd like your children to be like you, and you're willing to exert effort, costly effort, to make them like you. And let me call VNN the kind of normative preferences of a parent of type N that has a child of type N. Okay, so if you think the norm is inappropriate, you want to have a child that thinks the norm is inappropriate too. And you're willing to exert effort, YN, in order to make that happen. Okay, so like in Bessin and Verdier, there's this process of vertical socialization, which if you're a parent, you'll know is completely fruitless and ineffective. And after that fails, that was a joke. Jose is just a father, so I need to impart some wisdom. After that process of vertical socialization, then, if that fails, the child will be horizontally socialized by the population. Okay, could be, nevertheless, they end up like you, or they end up, with a different norm. Okay, and after that, the children are matched, and they play this, randomly matched, and they play this social dilemma with other children, okay, with different norm preferences, okay? So the payoff function of a parent is something like, here's your effort YN, so that's the probability that you successfully socialize your child. If you successfully socialize your child into your preference N, then you get this normative payoff VNN, okay? And then they play this. This is the expected payoff from having a child of type N play the social dilemma with a child of type M. Okay, so you can see there's going to be trade-offs here, because if you think the norm is inappropriate, you're going to inculcate that into your child. Okay, but then if the child thinks the norm is inappropriate, they're not going to cheat in the prisoner's dilemma, and that allows a child who thinks the norm is appropriate to actually take advantage of them. Okay, so for a parent who thinks the norm is inappropriate, then they're going to think through the payoff consequences of having a child of the same type as them matched in this social dilemma, and that could be adverse, but they're going to take that into account in their socialization decisions. With probability 1 minus n, you fail to socialize your child, then what happens? Then they get socialized by by people in society, could be your type, could be the opposite type, I or A. So they're going to end up with, you know, this is the N of the parent. They're going to end up with some type, could be A or I, depending on who they interact with. And then they're going to play the social dilemma game with a type M. Okay, so, and then there's just a quadratic cost function of exerting y. Okay, so this is just a simple addition to Brissin and Verdier. Okay, so what is this game they're going to play when they're matched together? So it's a classical prisoner's dilemma. There's the Pareto efficient equilibria. There's alpha alpha. So don't use means, you know, don't invoke the norm. So again, we're trying to do this a little bit more abstractly without getting into Sapo. But, you know, you see the motivation. Okay, hopefully, all right. And then alpha is greater than 1. So, you know, there's the Pareto inefficient equilibrium, you know, of 1, 1, and beta is greater than alpha. So if I forget the C's for a second, you just have a classic kind of prisoner's dilemma structure where, you know, the alpha isn't a Nash equilibrium because there's always an incentive to deviate, and then, you know, the dominant strategy equilibrium is everyone deviates and they end up with 1, 1 instead of alpha alpha. And the CNs are just in there Cn and Cm are just in there to capture whether or not you've been socialized into thinking the norm is inappropriate. Because if you think the norm is inappropriate, but nevertheless you invoke it, then you can do so, but that's going to be at a utility cost. Okay, so there's going to be utility cost to do that. And the way we're going to model this, the way we're going to model this, you know, is with a little bit of heterogeneity. So I've tried to kind of give you the intuition here that how you get an equilibrium where a majority of people think the norm is inappropriate, but nevertheless expect a majority of people to kind of invoke the norm, then you need heterogeneity between that set of people who think the norm is inappropriate. So the way we model that is just to say, okay, this utility cost C, if you think the norm is inappropriate and you use it, there's utility cost C, but there's some fraction of these people for which C is 0. So that's just a simple way of doing it. So there's an exogenous probability P that your cost, if you think the norm is inappropriate, your cost actually is C, and then there's a probability 1 minus P that it's actually 0, and then you look exactly like the type that thinks it's appropriate to use the norm. Okay, so that's how we model the heterogeneity. Let me just talk about these payoffs. Okay, so this is the expected utility of a type of a person who thinks that the norm is appropriate, of being this expected utility differential of a type that thinks the norm is appropriate. So it's appropriate to cheat in the social dilemma when matched against a type that thinks it's a type M. Okay, so this is the expected utility when they think it's appropriate. This is expected utility when they think it's inappropriate. Okay, and what you can show is that, you know, this thing is basically positive, and, you know, why is that positive? Kind of independent of who you're matched to. Well, that's just from the structure of the social dilemma. So whoever you're matched to, then, you know, it's better to think the norm is appropriate than inappropriate, because then, you know, if you that's just the standard kind of prisoner's dilemma. And it's also true that the difference between these differences is going to be positive, and that's, you know, that's just because thinking the norm is. No, I'm all confused now. Okay. Okay, I'm sure it's true, but I can't remember the intuition. Okay, all right. So if I go back to the objective function, so we can write down. So here's the objective function. You're just choosing y to maximize this thing, and you can write down the first order condition, the two first order conditions for the two types, okay? So here's the effort decision of a parent who thinks that it's appropriate. This has usual properties, which is, this is going to be increasing, for example, in the extent to which, the normative payoff you get. So the normative payoff you get of having a child the same type of you is larger, you're going to exert more effort. And if you think, and this thing here is positive, this is basically capturing the fact that, if you think, an added incentive of inculcating that cheating is appropriate is going to be, your child is going to get an expected utility benefit from that by going into the prisoner's dilemma, thinking that it's appropriate to cheat. Okay. On the other hand, if you think the norm is inappropriate, again, that's going to be increasing in. The normative utility you get from having a child the same as you. But now this has the opposite sign. This has a negative sign now, because what you're doing here is that if you inculcate thinking the norm is inappropriate into your child, you're actually kind of sending them into this social dilemma at a disadvantage. If they think it's inappropriate, they're not going to want to cheat. They're going to meet someone who thinks it's appropriate. They're going to be cheated by that person. Okay, so this enters with a negative sign here, because it sort of disincentivizes that kind of, exerting effort in some sense. All right. So that's, there's these first order conditions, and okay, this is my normal incompetence, all right? And so you just, what you can do is write down this differential equation. Again, this is pure Bissin and Verdier, looking at the dynamics of, of the fraction of types that think it's appropriate, and that's going to depend crucially on the kind of the difference between the efforts of the type that thinks it's appropriate or inappropriate. So this is, this, as usual, this has three steady state equilibria. There's one, where XA is 0. There's one where XA is 1 and XI is 0. And then there's one where those two, the efforts, the XA and XI are something interior, and these two efforts are going to be equal to each other. All right? So let me do that. So the first thing is just, under what conditions are you going to get an interior steady state equilibrium? So where you have basically both types. People who think calling someone a sapo is appropriate, someone who thinks it's inappropriate. Okay? So that's, that just follows, sufficient condition for that just follows from the first order condition for the type that thinks the norm is inappropriate. In some sense, that normative payoff has to be sufficiently large relative to this kind of expected disadvantage of going into the social dilemma with this norms whereby you think that it's inappropriate to kind of play the cheat in the social dilemma. Okay, so that normative preference has to be sufficiently large, and then that's a sufficient condition for an interior steady state. Under what conditions do you get what we're calling an antisocial norm, meaning a majority of people think it's inappropriate, but nevertheless, in equilibrium, a majority of people kind of invoke the norm. You just need two conditions. So one is you need basically this thing to be true. So we know there's an interior XA, but for XA to be greater than a half, you need this condition to be true, which is the differential between the normative payoffs for the type who thinks it's inappropriate and the type who thinks it's appropriate has to be larger than the kind of the sum of these expected utility benefits from going into this game, as, being willing to cheat in some sense, okay? So these normative payoffs have to be large. If this is true, then you have this internal equilibrium where the type that thinks it's inappropriate is greater than a half. And under what circumstances in this equilibrium would it be true that nevertheless, over a half of people would would actually cheat? Well, that's just about, the heterogeneity. So that this P has to be, the P has to be right. So that's just about the heterogeneity. You get the intuition. Remember that there's the types who think it's inappropriate, but only some fraction of them in the end have to pay this cost, okay, if they nevertheless cheat in the social dilemma. So you can think it's inappropriate, but if the cost is sufficiently low, nevertheless, you're going to be tempted cheat and try to deviate, okay? So that the way we formalize that is just in terms of this P, just a way of capturing the heterogeneity in a simple way. Okay, so I don't know how deep this is, but we found this kind of helpful. One analogy that Jose had, which is, if you ask people, do you think fairness is fairness the right thing to do? Then, people say yes. Here they say, right? Like, think about it here. So most people think that, fair behavior is appropriate. Nevertheless, when you've played the dictator game, you don't behave in a fair way. There's a distribution, but here you saw that people only don't give. People don't give on average 50%. Some people do, but they don't. There's a distribution. On average, they give 25%. So you have a normative. When people ask you about what do you think is fair, in some sense, you're like, that's your normative perspective. But then when you actually come to play the dictator game, there's a trade-off between your satisfying your normative preferences and the material benefits you get from keeping the money. So I guess that would be a simple way of thinking. Maybe it's kind of analogous to what's going on here if you think about it. We don't know how deep it is, but we found it helpful just to kind of think this through and kind of just how can you have such an equilibrium. So, all right. So last thing I have to say is, how long? Okay, all right. Well, people can ask some questions. So the last thing I have to say is, let's talk a little bit about the origin of these norms. Okay, so it seems that the origin of this norm is probably Spain. Like somebody gave the example. You might know this book, La Vida de Lazarillo de Tormes, which is a kind of very famous Spanish novel about the pícaro. The pícaro. Like Lazarillo de Tormes is someone who kind of lives. He's this poor person who lives on his wits by cheating, and he's sort of glamorous. The pícaro. And you can see here, this is the famous scene. He's taken under the wing of this blind person, and this is wine, isn't it? Wine, I think it's wine, and Lazarillo drills a hole. He drills a hole in the wine pot, and then he steals the wine with this straw, and he can't see because he's blind. So it's a very entertaining book if you haven't read it. But so there's there seems to be kind of cultural echoes of this in Spain. You could also connect it to this whole business of, I obey but I do not comply. Obedezco pero no cumplo. This idea that this sort of norm, in the Spanish colonial period of, I recognize the right of the Spanish king to write laws and edicts or whatever, but I reserve the right to kind of ignore them and not implement them. So that's, there's also echoes of this, I think, in this, culture of kind of avoiding rules. So, here's some real data, which is from the Latino Barometro, which is agreement on a scale of 1 to 6. Strongly disagree, strongly agree with the statement, in this country, if someone acts in an inappropriate way, others will strongly disagree. So in this country, if someone acts in an inappropriate way, others will strongly disagree. So what's interesting is that if you look at Europe, Spain is the lowest. And if you look at Latin America, Colombia is the lowest. Okay, so you say, well, there's less variation here than you might have expected, but at least within who's at the top? Sweden, of course, and Spain is at the bottom. But at least there's some evidence for the Spanish roots kind of hypothesis. We can't test that, so. What we can test a little bit is this idea that we just got by, just kind of going back through. Basically, we went through books and trying to see where this term came, when it was used, or whatever. So this is just, using Spanish corpus of texts, basically, but focused on Colombia. And you can see here, La Violencia starts in 1948. And April 1948, with the assassination of Gaitan, it sort of spikes up, and then it goes up systematically in the 1960s, and then it rockets up in the 1990s. So at least this provided some evidence that something is going on here during the period of La Violencia. And when we dug into that, we found a lot of other qualitative information on that. So why would this calling people a sapo suddenly start, like it becoming bad to be a sapo? Well, it's a civil war. There's a civil war. People are trying to control information. They're trying to stop kind of civilians informing the government of where these different liberal guerrillas are or partisans. You're trying to control information. You're trying to control people, these are just posters from the 1950s. Sangre Negra, Black Blood, was a famous liberal guerrillero, and it says, do you want to be another victim of Sangre Negra? Okay, so what are they doing? They're trying to get people to rat out Sangre Negra. Tell us, where is he? Where is his people? Denounce to the authorities. This is again denouncing another bandolero. Okay, so you can imagine in this context where the government is trying to get people to denounce and give information, then these people want to spread this norm to shut people up. They want to make it kind of socially inappropriate, but maybe that didn't succeed, but they want to make it an equilibrium for people to keep their mouths shut. Okay, so it seems like there's really a kind of mechanism here which ties it to la violencia. And, just if you look at sources there's a very rich kind of historical literature in Colombia on the violencia and patterns of violence in that period. And this whole issue of a sapo, this is from Maria Victoria Uribe, is it? Yeah, Maria Victoria Uribe. There's people being called a sapo, so the expression gets used in kind of case study evidence on kind of retribution in La Violencia. And maybe the most interesting evidence is from this book, which was a very famous sociological study of La Violencia, which was published in the 1960s by Guzman Campos and Orlando Falsborda, I guess also a very famous Colombian sociologist. And they pointed out there was a whole language of La Violencia. So in the Violencia, a whole new language appeared. Okay, and here's some of the language. Sapear, well, that's like the verb sapo. So they actually point to this verb, this word sapo appearing in the context of kind of, an informer, somebody informing. And they say at the bottom here, interestingly enough, it's passed into general usage in Colombia. So they even point out in the 1960s that this language came out of the violence, but then it got into sort of norm, into society. I notice here, looking at this, pasar al papayo. This is also another very interesting Colombianism. No, it's like the papaya. Don't give papaya. So this also seems to come back to the, But it's papaya, I don't know, yeah. Yeah, I don't know, yeah. Okay, so just to give you so this was what so let's go and we collect some information. We went back to, there's attrition here, unfortunately, what's the expression, hindsight is a marvelous thing, no, whatever. So, of course, this was an idea we had after we connected. So then we had to go back to the students, and so there's attrition here, unfortunately. But what we asked, just in a simple way, was, did the participant know, there was one grandparent, which we tried to kind of measure this impact of la violencia on individuals. Was one grandparent a victim of la violencia? And also, whether they were liberals, So there used to be this cliche in Colombia about how everyone was either a liberal or a conservative, and this was passed between, generations and generations. It seems to have completely disappeared now, but even when I first started coming to Colombia, this was still the conventional wisdom. So we thought this was something that people would know that might help us get a clear answer to, were you likely to be a victim? Well, the people who were likely to be victims was more likely to be liberals than conservatives. So we could ask about this and hope that people would actually know the answer, because this used to so famously run in families. Okay, so just to give you some sense of what we find here, I don't want to, so this is hideously unidentified, you could say here. So one thing we find here, for example, is like, this is just looking at the sent amount. So the amount sent by the dictator. we find, very robust, positive, significant effects here. But I don't think we really want to interpret that because it's like very endogenous, so it's not identified that at all. So I think we're much more interested in kind of trying to interpret some of the interactions with this kind of randomized, I didn't talk too much, we randomized people into these different treatments. So what we have is, we basically have two measures of la violencia, which is like a kind of dummy at the kind of individual level, and we can look at how it affects people's play. And what seems to be sort of interesting, is that if I look at this SAPO treatment, then it seems to significantly reduce the amount sent. So this is referring to the send, this is how much the sender, this is la violencia, this is the dummy variable, this is referring to like, was the sender's family victimized, by in these the two columns correspond to these two different measures, whether or not you have a memory of victimization or whether or not you had liberal grandparents. So that's what the two columns are. You see, like that it seems to that this is this heterogeneity. So remember that we collected this information after we did the games. Okay, so it's not that when we did the games, we announced who had been victimized by la violencia or anything like that, okay? So this is just kind of pure heterogeneity, kind of ex post, like looking at these interactions. So it's pretty surprising that it works. And so, in some sense what we're finding here is, in fact, if you look at here with the sort of SAPO, then a lot of the explanatory power loads onto people who have this family history of victimization during la violencia, okay? So it's not explaining, where this came from, but it is explaining perhaps why this became so salient in Colombia and, why people behave the way they do in these games, okay? We could also look at, from the perspective of the receiver, the expected amount sent. We don't really find anything here. I'm not sure. But yeah. So, and then the last thing we could do, you could sort of ask is, well, what about, surely like the most interesting thing here to look at would be, you're the third party, okay? If you have a history, if your family have a history of kind of exposure or victimization during la violencia, how does that affect your propensity to kind of punish? It's, depends. Depends on how you measure la violencia. So in some specifications, this is the thing that I'm interested in here, okay? In some specifications, you do see this negative effect, but it's not always significant, but it's horribly underpowered here. So this is a problem with the attrition, I think. Okay, so, and then, we don't see much with these expectations either, okay? The final thing you might be interested in, again, we're super, super underpowered here, because only a fraction of senders who were punished actually sent the SAPO message, so we're really down to a few people. So you might think, like, okay, that what you should be doing is, this history of la violencia should predict, who is it that's kind of calling people a SAPO, And there's a little bit of evidence, but, we're super, super underpowered to say much about that. So I don't think we want to push these things too much, so that's why it sort of comes at the end. It's like a little bit of evidence about where this might have come from or why it might have become so prevalent in Colombia. Okay, so and then so that's basically all I have. I have a slide summing it up. Maybe I should just shut up and let people ask questions.
Thank you very much. As you mentioned, No Seas Sapo is not only a sanction, a social sanction, but also a threat against life. And it is one of the most salient phrases in threats against social leaders in Colombia. So, do you have any ideas about the relationship between this and the intention to fracture social organization and social capital? But additionally, I was thinking that how does this tradition play a role as a form of protection of life also? Yes. And I think that No Seas Sapo must treat different if we think as a social sanction, but if you think as a threat, is a different the impact and the analysis.
It's a threat in the sense of, in the game theoretic terminology, it'd be kind of off the equilibrium path, So here the idea is like, even if the sender doesn't actually call the third party a sapo, just allowing for that, which is sort of common knowledge, deters the third party from kind of punishing an unfair sender. So that's a sort of threat. Of course, it's a very kind of anodyne threat compared to what actually happens in Colombia, as you're saying, that this is used in a very kind of high stakes way in Colombian society, and this is trying to get at that in a very controlled kind of context. This is trying to get at that in a very sort of controlled context. I think it would be fabulous, and we've talked about it, to try to do this, maybe in a context where you could do a field experiment or some kind of lab in the field, or try to make it more real than just doing it with Los Andes students, with all due respect to Los Andes students and professors in the room. I think that would be fascinating, but I think it's also, it's also like very challenging kind of ethically, I think, to do it in that context, yeah. But I'm not sure I have anything deep to say about your point. But I agree, I agree with the thrust of your comment that, this is a very powerful kind of social thing. I think we're just trying to draw attention to that and how kind of first order it is, with the tools we have available to do that. Yeah, but.
Great. Juan Camilo?
Thank you for the presentation. It's fascinating how you combine history with theory and experimental results, and it's just very enlightening. And I was thinking of the stability of that bad equilibrium, and if from the model you have thought of what are the types of shocks that can take this to the better equilibrium, in which eventually being a sapo becomes being someone that is prosocial and wants to maintain another type of norm.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of food binding in China.
Uh-huh.
So 1,000 years it lasts, and then all of a sudden this dynamic of the so-called natural feed societies,
yeah,
where these clusters of circles of families, and this is why I was thinking about your model of this intergenerational thinking. So these natural feed societies are these clubs of fathers who make an agreement that it's okay not to bind the feet of their children.
Yeah.
And in a generation, food binding disappears.
Yeah.
So have you thought about the stability and that what kind of shocks shift this to another equilibrium?
Not really. I mean, we did try to work on a model with La Violencia and the kind of intergenerational transmission, but it got terribly complicated, and it just seemed like too much for the paper. Like trying to make the simple point was more powerful. I do think it's like super interesting, from the perspective of changing things, that most people don't think this is acceptable or appropriate. Like in some sense, that's a very hopeful kind of message, like in the sense of, like, it's a trap, people are trapped somehow, but underneath it there's this kind of normative opposition to this, and that seems to be, I don't know how to intervene to kind of leverage that. But you certainly do see these transitions, like, Eliana Ferrara has this there's data now from Somalia, like looking at female genital mutilation. So female genital mutilation hasn't sort of disappeared in Somalia, but what you've seen in the last 20 years is a radical transition from an extremely invasive form of female genital mutilation, which used to be like 90% of girls, to a way, way, way less invasive. And within 20 years, it's completely flipped, and the super invasive form has gone from 90 to like 5, and the less invasive, which you might not be happy about either, but it's certainly better than was, has gone from like 10% to 90% or something. So that's an incredibly dramatic change also. So I don't know, like what, I think we'd be very happy to talk about the ideas. I mean, I think like, and Tanas Mokas obviously had ideas about how you perturb this equilibrium and how you, but maybe he was trying to do the wrong thing because, he was trying to affect people's normative attitudes, but this data suggests that people's normative attitudes already don't support it. So that's not where you should be trying to intervene, right? I mean,
yeah, so I had exactly the same question as Juan Camilo, and I also wanted to comment on his mentioning of foot binding in China, how that came about and how that was abolished overnight. It came about because in Song Dynasty, which was about around 900, there was an emperor who adores small feet in women. He was a very good poet, and so it became a fashion. And it lasted for about 1,000 years, and when the last emperor was overthrown, there was a huge media campaign about the new women who go to school, who go out of the house to work, and who have normal feet. And so the fashion just became obsolete. And I was wondering whether something like the supple tradition can also disappear once there's a huge media campaign about it.
Yeah. So we have one question here, then one other there.
Hi. It's kind of the same line as the others, but here we maybe have a field experiment that we can do on this, because we work at the Norwegian tax office, and we are set out to discover what determines people's willingness to pay taxes. So we work in tax collection, and what we struggle with is like the richest people, they evade tax. And so I have this hypothesis that they were like socialized, the more rich that they get, to not pay taxes, and in the fear that you will look like an idiot if you pay your taxes, because no one, they use like advisors, they use active people to evade the tax, and even when I'm like in private parties, people come up to me and they like brag about all the ways they evade tax to me working at the tax office. So it seems that there is this antisocial norm that when you reach a certain like class of income, then you get socialized to not pay your tax, and you like share different ways to evade tax, and that's a huge problem. So I was like interested to discuss with you guys, like how can we intervene this? Like this is a norm you're like socialized into when you get a higher income. So yeah, do you have like any intuition in how?
But I mean, I don't know much about tax evasion. You're saying it's like richer people who want to avoid taxes, who become. Yeah, I'm sure that's true in the United States also. It must be true. Like, I've been at meetings with wealthy donors at the University of Chicago where they sit around talking about how to evade taxes and how if you move to Florida and buy 6 houses, you can basically become a citizen. And you don't have to live in Florida because it sucks, but it has very low taxes. And it's just like, it's mind-boggling. But I don't know. I don't know the literature too well on this sort of tax. I mean, there's a lot of work in economics at the moment on like tax morale and trying to figure out, like Tim Besley's been doing this work at the LSE, trying to look at how you kind of get people, how you sort of construct some sort of social contract to get people. Is it, I kind of provide something, I really give you public goods, and there's like Asim Khwaja and Ben Olkin are doing this empirical work in Pakistan, looking at what sort of thing triggers tax morale or willingness to pay taxes, but I don't know what it, I suspect it doesn't, none of that really speaks to the question you're kind of talking about. You know, I don't think they're not looking at rich people in Pakistan, for example. So I don't know. I mean, I could put you in touch with my friend in Bogota who used to be the head of DIAN, Juan Ricardo Ortega. Like, he knows a lot about who doesn't pay taxes and why in Colombia. But if you investigate that too much in Colombia, like he did, you know, you need 6 bodyguards and you have to leave the country. So he did. He left for 5 years. So I mean, yeah, I don't know. That's certainly a problem here. But I don't have anything deep to say about it. What I do have something to say about is this inequality that I couldn't interpret. So I want to come back to this inequality that I couldn't interpret and tell you why it's positive. Because this is the expected, you know, this is the expected utility from playing the social dilemma for a type that thinks the norm, it's appropriate to cheat, okay? But this is playing against a type that thinks it's inappropriate. So if you think it's appropriate and the other person thinks it's inappropriate, you're going to be able to take advantage of them, okay? You're going to be able to deviate on them and you'll get the deviation payoff, okay? Whereas this is your expected utility, you know, when you're playing against a type that thinks it's appropriate. This is still positive, of course, because, you know, you're going to end up in the cheat-cheat equilibrium, but that's better than being in the, you know, in the other equilibrium. But this payoff is bound to be bigger than that, because here you get to take advantage of the sucker, you know, or the type who thinks it's inappropriate to cheat. Sorry, I couldn't get the intuition for that right before, but now I did. Funny how the mind works. Yeah. Yes?
I think on the people who think it's inappropriate but end up cheating, it's kind of, to me, it seems clear that the incentives are too high and you want to deviate from even what you personally think, which is what makes it very interesting and different from some of the other things that try to change norms. So, and then the question is, what are the incentives? It comes down to almost like calculating the incentives that there are to cheat. And so some of these ideas about doing it in the field where there's very strong incentives to cheat or not could help in that variation. But your story about La Violencia makes me think about the work on trauma and memory and the way in which it's very hard to adjust to a new set of returns and costs. And so the incentives in your world that you see right now are not actually those. You're distorted in the way you're viewing the returns and costs because of the memory that you have faced or that you've been told stories about from your ancestors.
Yeah.
And so then it makes a lot of sense. And that there's a lot of literature in sort of psychiatry on this where it's really maladaptive, but it's very, very difficult to update. Mm-hmm. And so then that suggests an intervention that would be about updating, allowing people to experiment, really, because just telling them is they're not gonna believe it because it's so emotional. And so just allowing them to experiment with collecting data on the actual returns and costs.
Yeah.
If what they truly want to do is behave appropriately.
Yeah. I mean, that's not a literature I know well, but I'd be certainly happy to know it better, yeah.
So we have, I saw one question, Cesar, Diego and Lata, and we're going to take these 3 questions, and then we have to...
I think part of the problem with sort of trying to model this violencia, as I was saying to Juan Camilo, is it's not obvious to us exactly how to model that, you know, exactly. So, but I think the work on trauma can help you with that. Yeah, okay.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Robinson, for this talk. So I was thinking on the puzzle that you mentioned at some point in terms of, okay, dictator game is neither efficient nor inefficient, but then the no sea sapo norm actually creates some inefficiency because the punishment is reduced. So this is puzzling, right? But maybe one way to tackle this puzzle is that we can think on the no sea sapo as some sort of fight or flight in terms of norm enforcement. And my impression is that if you think on the no sea sapo as a way to just tell kids in terms of the vertical transmission on whether they should try to protect against counter-punishment, which is accepting the no sea sapo norm because then they will not get punished versus trying to enforce, maybe this could help solve this puzzle of the inefficiency, because the other thing that I see from the experimental evidence with respect to your model is that I'm not that convinced about the vertical transmission in which parents are maybe passing this social norm on no sea sapo, but maybe they're just trying to protect their kids. And the way in which you can protect like this parental version is not thinking on the problem from the side of sanction, but from the fear of counter-sanction, right? So if you see all this literature on antisocial punishment, maybe there's something there that...
So I think we want to distinguish this from this literature on anti-social punishment. I mean, so we talk about that in the paper, but this idea that, like, you punish, you can, I don't think it is the same as antisocial punishment. I do think, your suggestion is very interesting that, like, one motive for kind of, transmitting this norm to your children would be if you thought they were going to be punished. So if actually when we were trying to develop this model of, like, when the violencia comes, that was exactly the mechanism that we tried to use to sort of say, how does this thing spread? Well, of course, you don't want your child to be punished. So then you inculcate, don't be a sapo, because then they'll stay away from actions that would lead them to be punished. And then the violencia, that's a transitory thing that disappears, but then that gets propagated. So I think that's one of the mechanisms. The thing which was harder to kind of think about was these kind of psychological mechanisms today, meaning how exactly does that how does that history exactly affect the way you play this game? It seems more like a kind of system number one type sort of phenomenon that, like, whether they're even conscious of this themselves, it's like you put them in a certain, and it's sort of like something triggers this memory or whatever. And I think I just myself didn't really understand how to model that, but I think that's exactly right about how to think about what gets this going. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. It's very, very interesting. So my question was kind of related to different questions that were asked before, especially regarding this antisocial punishment. So there are some kind of older papers that show that when there is like a counter, like a second round of punishment to punish the punisher, you get something very similar. So and then you see like there is only some people who are actually maintaining this equilibrium. So I was wondering if it is really the fact that you are telling someone who is a sapo, or that person is like being perceived as a sapo because he also knows about this norm, right? So like, would it be the same if like people are just observing this happening as opposed to this person being told he's a sapo?
I mean, I think it's not I'm not quite sure I understand your second point, but I think the reason it's not the same as antisocial punishment is it's not that, like, if I call you a sapo, it doesn't affect your payoff at all, Like, it's payoff, it has no consequences for the payoff. I just send you the message, mind your own business. So I think we thought you can't get sort of revenge on someone who, it's more like you're drawing attention to the fact that by punishing me, you're violating this Colombian norm, which is you're basically being a sapo. And so I think that's how we thought about it. As being distinct from this, punishing someone who punished you, or antisocial punishment or something like that. So that's why we didn't have this payoff consequences. We didn't allow this calling you a sapo to reduce your punishment, to reduce your payoff, because then it is going to look much more like that. But
Okay, and so the second part of the question was about this, whether like an intervention where people are just observing this would be different.
People are not. So
like basically, if people like if I am a sapo and everyone is watching what I'm doing, but no one says I am a sapo, do I feel the same way as if someone tells me I'm a sapo?
Well, everything is sort of. I mean, there's sort of there's complete information. People are matched together. I don't know. We don't have a stage where you know, people have to stand up if they were a Sapo, or I don't know if you're imagining some different kind of game where...
Yeah, something different.
Yeah, well, that's not how we did it. Yeah, we did think about doing things like that, but I think but we never did anything like that. So, I mean, that might be interesting, but I don't have anything to say really on that. Yeah.
Thank you.
One last question, and we can move after some words of closing. We can move the discussion to the coffee, to the lunch.
Thank you, Jim. I wanted to take you back to the results of the third-party dictator game. So you showed us the social appropriateness of what the receivers think and the third party thinks. But I also wondered whether they would have self-serving motives. And therefore, I was curious whether you also asked the beliefs from the dictators as to what they think other dictators think about this situation.
From the perspective of the dictators?
Yeah.
No, we didn't ask that. I mean, I think I talked about the receivers because they're a sort of dummy player, so they have less, it seemed like there'd be less experimented demand effects, or there'd be less incentive to kind of misrepresent. I don't know, Jose is the expert on this, not me, so I'm sure he'd have a better answer, yeah.
I understand the idea that the receivers, because they're neutral, they would be, they would have a better sense of, I mean, the data would be clean from the receivers. But in this particular case, they would also have a self-serving motive because the money is coming to them. So I guess I just wondered if you had some beliefs from the dictator's side of the story.
Yeah. I don't know, we didn't ask, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay.
Okay, I want to make one announcement in case you haven't checked your emails. After the closing words, there's going to be lunch outside, okay? But please join me in a round of applause to thank Julian Mora Peña and his team to help us put everything together and to be patient with the academic organizers. And I also want to thank Charles and the ESA in general for bringing the World Meeting for the first time to Latin America. I think it's really, really helpful for Latin American scholars doing experimental research to be able to host the World Meeting of the ESA here. So thank you, Charles. And also thank you, Charles and Ian, for also bringing for the first time the workshop choice process data to the World Meeting instead to the North American meeting.
That was too kind, Mariana. Let me just say a couple of words on behalf of the ESA. This is a big moment in the history of ESA, our first world meeting in Latin America, and it just shows that experimental economics is alive and well in this part of the world and is becoming more and more global, and the ESA is very happy to see that. I'd like to kind of thank the people who made this really a special event. Our plenary speakers, thank you very much. I'll collectively thank all the plenary speakers for wonderful talks, and so I'm going to give them a hand of applause. Finally, there are three people who've been kind of running around, putting out fires and making this whole thing happen, having this whole thing function, and so I'd like to recognize them individually. So, first I'd like to recognize Julian. Julian, thank you. You've been running around fixing everything broken here, and we really appreciate it. The next person I'd like to thank is Jose Alberto, who is a new father, and many of us know how trying a time that can be, and you've been able to organize such a successful conference, and we appreciate it as well. So we have a little something for you. Thanks a lot, Jose. Finally, the last but certainly not least, I'd like to thank Mariana, who really made the whole thing happen. And so we're very grateful to Mariana, and it's been a great experience for us. Okay, so I guess we can safely adjourn the conference now. Is that so? And or you have announcements still? Okay, so.
So thanks everybody for being here. I want to invite you to the party, to the scenario. Huh? No, there's no party. No more parties. So I can take a photo of the whole conference. I know there's some people that are left, but it will be amazing to have this memory for the faculty. And Jose wanted to say something.
And thank you, Charles, for these really nice flowers. I would also, as part of the organizing committee, would like to thank the other organizing members. Their role was less visible than Mariana's house, but equally really important to Miguela Martinez Carrasco, Juan Camilo Cárdenas, María Alejandra Vélez, and Julia Seither. And I want to... And please come to the stage.
Gracias.